Philosophy of Mind, Lecture 8. What are thoughts?
We concluded Lecture 6, our discussion of the possibility of computer mentality, with the observation that meaning seems essential to mentality and to intentional states such as thoughts, beliefs, and desires in particular. Such states are always about something, directed towards something, such as a proposition. After our quick look in the last lecture at the problem of mind-body causation, we're now ready to focus our attention on intentionality, the philosopher's name for this feature of meaningfulness or aboutness. Now recall way back in Lecture 1 that one way some philosophers think we can distinguish the mental from the physical is precisely in virtue of intentionality. Most ordinary physical things seem to lack the property. A piece of wood just sits there doing what it does, but it doesn't seem to be about anything. To the contrary, some mental states do seem to have this property as a defining trait. Your beliefs, for example. You might believe that it's sunny today or that 1 + 1 = 2. But in each case, the belief has an object, something it's about, where what it's about defines precisely which belief it is. Similarly, you may desire various things, or think various things, or hope or fear or regret, and so on. All of these are intentional states insofar as they have objects in this way. We also questioned back in Lecture 1 whether intentionality is really an entirely adequate criterion for distinguishing mental from physical. First, it's arguable that some mental states are not intentional states. You might just feel sad or pain without either being about anything. And more generally, what we've been calling qualia seem to lack intentionality. But more importantly for us now, there are physical things which are at least candidates for possessing intentionality as well. Linguistic objects such as words and sentences and photographs. These are purely physical, yet they're possessed of meanings or they represent objects respectively. Thermostats, as we saw, have readings of or about the room temperature, and the electrical circuits in your local ATM are about such things as deposits, withdrawals, and account balances. Any theory of intentionality will clearly have to say something about these sorts of examples. In any case, there's no question that intentionality is at least a central feature of the mind. For intentional states such as thoughts, beliefs, and desires are clearly marked by their intentionality, and they're a major component of our mental life. And so no study of the philosophy of mind would be complete without a serious engagement with the question, what is the nature of intentionality, aboutness? Physicalism and intentionality. What we'd love to find, of course, is a physicalist theory of intentionality. Such a theory would be one explaining how intentionality can arise in purely physical systems by means of physical processes and properties. And we'd love to find such a theory of intentionality because doing so would be, in effect, to solve the mind-body problem, or at least a large part of it. If intentional states could be explained in terms of physical entities, events, and laws, then intentionality at least would not support the dualist view of the mind as some sort of mysterious non-physical thing not located anywhere in physical space. But what if intentional states cannot be explained physically? Well, that in itself wouldn't prove dualism, of course. We might just not yet have discovered the right physicalist theory. But then, on the other hand, the inability to explain intentionality in physical terms might provide at least some sort of evidence against physicalism. In particular, we might discover, as we examine different theories and their flaws, fairly concrete and explicit reasons to think that no physical explanation of intentionality will ever be possible. In this lecture, we'll look primarily at the innovative theory of Tufts philosopher Daniel Dennett, who tries to illuminate intentionality without attempting to provide an explicitly physicalist account of it, although his account is quite friendly to physicalism. In the next lecture, Lecture 9, we'll look at probably the most influential physicalist theory of intentionality, known as the computational theory of mind. According to that theory, intentional states are rather like little sentences in our heads, not in any ordinary language such as English, but in a so-called language of thought. And once we've sketched the basic idea of the language of thought, we'll turn in Lecture 10 to various theories about how the sentences in the language of thought come to be meaningful or about things, or, in other words, to possess intentionality. So our next several lectures will be focusing on intentionality. Original versus derived intentionality. Let's begin with that important distinction. Recall from a moment ago those physical things which seem to be legitimate candidates, at least, for possessing intentionality. Linguistic objects, photographs, thermostats. computer circuits. We raise those as potentially undermining the idea that intentionality might be a defining mark specifically of the mental. But let's now briefly explore whether we may be able to resist seeing these as genuinely possessing intentionality after all. The way to do this is to invoke a distinction some philosophers make between what they call original intentionality and derived intentionality. The basic idea is simple. Many things may be treated as if they possessed intentionality, as intentional, it's suggested, without their actually possessing intentionality. Such things would have at best what we call derived intentionality. They derive their intentionality from the beings who treat them as if they were intentional. In contrast, other things, such as our minds, truly do have intentionality in their own right, in no way derived from or dependent upon being treated as intentional by something else. Thus we, or our minds, have not derived but original intentionality. With this distinction in mind, let's return to our candidates. Linguistic objects, such as words or sentences. Sure, we might say, the word banana is about something, bananas. In that sense, it possesses intentionality, since it has aboutness. But of course, it's clear that this word doesn't have this aboutness intrinsically on its own. There's nothing either about that pattern of ink on a page or those sounds when they're uttered that's about bananas. Rather, human beings have decided, perhaps by some sort of convention, to use that word to stand for, represent, be about the object bananas. Thus, we might conclude, linguistic objects like words and sentences only have derived intentionality. They may be used or treated by us as being about things, but their aboutness depends on their being used, so used by us. To the contrary, our ability to have thoughts about bananas does not depend on or derive from anything else. It's just the nature of minds to be able to have thoughts about things. So minds have original intentionality. And then, of course, there are those computer circuits. Again, the analysis is plain. Let's recall John Searle's Chinese room thought experiment from Lecture 6. Computers do all sorts of things, and they display all sorts of physical activities and processes. But none of it now is meaningful on its own intrinsically. No pattern of electrical firings is in itself about anything or possessed of intentionality. That was Searle's ultimate point in insisting that purely formal symbols don't have any meanings. What misleads many people about computers, of course, is that we project our own intentionality onto the doings of the symbols. We interpret its symbols. We provide their meanings. And we thus treat its activities as if they were meaningful themselves. In our current language, then, we might say that a properly programmed computer possesses at best derived intentionality. It can be treated as intentional or interpreted as such by beings like us, namely beings with genuine minds possessed of genuine original intentionality. With this distinction now in place, the main question we're exploring might be formulated this way. What is the nature of original intentionality? What makes it the case that some things, our minds, can be in states which are about things? And we'll begin with a theory which, ironically, actually blurs the line between derived and original intentionality, which we've just been so busy establishing. What does make it the case that we have intentional states? Consider some simple belief you may have, say that today is Thursday. Now ask yourself, what makes it the case? What makes it true that you have this belief, this very belief with the specific content or object that it has? More than likely, your instinct would be to answer something like this. Well, some feature or aspect of my brain makes it true that I have this belief. Or perhaps, developing that a bit, if it really is a true fact about me that I have this belief, then there's some true fact about me that makes it the case that I have this belief. And one very plausible kind of true fact would be about something going on in my brain, some brain state or brain activity. And if this is the right sort of answer about our beliefs in general, then we might even suppose that for most possible beliefs, there's an absolute answer to the question of whether you do or do not have that belief. You either believe there's milk in the fridge or you do not. You either believe that God exists or you do not, and so on. You have the relevant belief if the right sort of thing is inside your head, and you lack that belief if that sort of thing is not. On this very intuitive view, the question of whether a person has a particular belief is a perfectly objective internal matter of fact. It's either the case or not, with no other possibilities in between. And further, this intuitive view is quite comfortable with physicalism, for it holds that having beliefs is a matter of having the right sorts of brain things going on. According to Daniel Dennett, however, that question seeks not so much a purely and straightforwardly objective answer, but is rather more like the question of whether a person, quote, is immoral or has style or talent or would make a good spouse, end quote. That is to say, it's something far more fuzzy, subjective, a matter of taste, or maybe a matter of some interpretation. While Dennett won't deny a certain kind of objectivity to the answer, what makes his view most important for our purposes anyway is its stress on the degree of subjectivity involved in whether or not a person has a given belief. For want of a better name, he refers to his theory as interpretationism. The basic idea is that whether an individual has a particular belief or not is not a purely objective fact about the inside of his or her head, but is in some respect a matter of interpretation. To put it in a single sentence, Dennett writes, quote, "What it is to be a true believer is to be an intentional system, a system whose behavior is reliably and voluminously predictable via the intentional strategy," end quote. Well, we'll need at least a few more sentences to unpack that sentence. Intentional states and behavior. Under what conditions does a being count as having genuine intentional states, such as beliefs and desires, in other words? If its behavior is predictable under certain conditions by interpreting it as having intentional states, there's nothing more to being a being with beliefs and desires than being a being whose behavior is well predictable when we interpret it as having beliefs and desires. According to Dennett's position, this interpretationism, the attribution of intentional states is an instrument we use to predict the behavior of various beings, including other people, of course. And the reality of intentional states is entirely exhausted by this predictive role. Nothing more needs to be said about what's going on inside the being, or what facts make it true that a being has intentional states. Having beliefs is a matter only of being predictable on the attribution of beliefs, not of anything that's going on inside the head. Now that may sound strange, but perhaps it isn't once you think about it. After all, for millennia, human beings have been ascribing intentional states to each other, taking other people to believe and desire and hope for and fear various things and so on. And yet, people have known nothing of the inner workings of the brain, no more than most people today know, as a matter of fact. If the attribution of beliefs and thoughts depended on what was going on inside the brain, then how could the ancients, and most of us today, ever make such attributions? Not to mention, make these attributions with the confidence with which we typically do make them. Indeed, they and we surely could not be mistaken, at least in general, in attributing beliefs and thoughts to their fellow human beings. Maybe we're wrong here or there about what specific things various people believe, but in general we're surely right in many or most of our attributions. But if we're generally right in our attribution of intentional states to others, and we know nothing of what's going on in their brains, then our basic attribution of intentional states must not be making any substantive or implicit reference to the workings of the brain. Other people's having intentional states will be a matter of the kinds of things that are available to observers, namely the predictability of their behavior. So don't think of beliefs and desires or other intentional states as inner states of a being. They are just tools we use to predict behavior, or at least so Dennett suggests. But now, what exactly are tools to predict behavior? It turns out that there are many, and we can get clearer on Dennett's theory by examining several. The astrological stance. There are many strategies one might take, Dennett points out, for predicting someone's behavior, some better, some worse. One might be this. Take the date and hour and location of the person's birth, and then consult an astrologer to get some predictions about this person's future and future actions. This strategy, Dennett remarks, is, quote, deplorably popular, deplorable because we have such good reasons for believing that it does not work, end quote. But it is a strategy, replete with entire detailed methods, concepts, terminology, and theories, and if it doesn't succeed well in accurately predicting behavior, It surely has succeeded at least in capturing the human imagination, not to mention pocketbook in some cases. To adopt this strategy is, as Dennett puts it, to take the astrological stance towards predicting behavior, to use astrology towards predicting behavior. The physical stance. But there is a better, if still not perfect, strategy available. One takes what Dennett calls the physical stance towards predicting behavior when one treats the being in question as a purely physical being subject entirely and exclusively to the laws of nature. The idea here is that, in principle anyway, we can treat physical beings as collections of physical molecules or particles, and learn all the laws of biology and chemistry and physics and neuroscience and so on, and then predict what will happen to those molecules or particles by virtue of those laws. Taking the physical stance works quite well for the chemist or physicist in the lab, naturally, as they study the physical phenomena that interest them. But it also works for the baker, as he or she can predict what will happen by leaving the cake in the oven too long. In principle, too, we imagine that we could take this stance towards human beings, although it's obviously limited in practice due to our inability to know the precise physical states of our peers, and of course our very limited knowledge of the relevant laws governing the insides of the human body. So that's the physical stance. This next leads to the design stance. Due to just these sorts of limits on the physical stance, it's often more convenient, and indeed more effective, to take the design stance. Here one ignores the actual physical details of the object, and instead treats the system as if it has some sort of design and will behave pretty much as designed under normal conditions. Consider, for example, how we interact with our thermostats and our calculators and our telephones and our computers. We typically haven't the slightest idea how these things are built, or what's inside them, or what the laws of physics are, but instead we have a pretty good idea of what they're designed to do, and thus we can pretty reliably predict what will happen when we hit certain buttons or do various things with the object in question. Pretty clearly, the design stance is far easier to use for such objects than the physical stance. Who has the time or resources to figure out the precise state of every particle of the alarm clock and then apply the laws of physics to those particles to predict where they'll be in a few hours? Instead, we just set the thing to 8:13 a.m. and predict that it will ring at 8:13 a.m. What could be easier? But equally clearly, the design stance has its own limits. For many things, we may not know the design, for example. But even more importantly, there will be times when things do not work as they're designed to work. Something might have broken on the inside. The thing might be poorly programmed. Maybe the calculator has just been submerged in water by your toddler. When things break down in particular, the design stance won't work. And if you want to figure out how to fix it, you'll have to revert back to the physical stance for the thing. And so, too, the design stance may not always be practical, as in the case of our dealings with our fellow human beings, who in general do not display the kind of design that makes the design stance so useful for dealing with artifacts. Fortunately, there's one more tool in Dennett's toolbox, the intentional stance. Here, according to Dennett, is how the intentional stance works. Quote, "First, you decide to treat the object whose behavior is to be predicted as a rational agent. Then, you figure out what beliefs that agent ought to have, given its place in the world and its purpose. Then, you figure out what desires it ought to have on the same considerations. And finally, you predict that this rational agent will act to further its goals in the light of its beliefs. A little practical reasoning from the chosen set of beliefs and desires will, in many instances, yield a decision about what the agent ought to do, and that is what you predict the agent will do." End quote. So let's illustrate all that with an example. Suppose your friend, Fred, tells you that he'll meet you at the theater at 7:30 p.m. tonight. Under normal circumstances, you have no trouble predicting that Fred will be there at the theater at 7:30 p.m. or thereabouts. But how exactly do you make this prediction? Well, step 1. You assume that Fred is a rational agent, that is, one who makes judgments about what's most rational to do and wants to actually do whatever he deems is most rational to do. Step 2. You then figure out what beliefs and desires Fred ought to have, meaning thereby that you develop a theory about which intentional states he has. Well, there are a bunch of beliefs about geography to start. Fred has beliefs about where he is, about where the theater is, about how to get from here to there. Then there are Fred's beliefs about you, that you desire to see this performance, that you desire to meet him on time. And there are other relevant beliefs, such as his belief that friendship is valuable and that punctuality is important to friendship, and so on. And there are numerous relevant desires you must ascribe to Fred as well. You ascribe to him a desire to see the performance, to maintain you as a friend, to be punctual, and so on. Step 3. You then do a little practical reasoning with all these intentional states. You imagine that Fred is examining all of his relevant beliefs and desires and attempting to determine on that basis what he ought to do. Presumably, given his desires to see the show and maintain your friendship, and his beliefs that punctuality is important for maintaining friendship, in addition to those beliefs about how to get to the theater and so on, it follows that as a rational being, he will make every reasonable effort to get to the theater at 7:30 p.m. or closely thereabouts. Step 4. You then predict that Fred will do what he judges to be most rational to do, which you have just now reasoned is to show up on time at the theater. So this simple activity, meeting someone at the theater, turns out to involve a whole lot of theoretical reasoning. It's the sort we do every day, all the time, in all of our interactions with other people, even if we do manage to do it quickly, automatically, and often quite subconsciously. And it is precisely by doing this sort of reasoning about others that we take the intentional stance towards them. Note, of course, that you do all this while having essentially no knowledge of the inner physical workings of Fred. You couldn't even begin to take the physical stance towards him, even if you wanted to, lacking all that information about his molecules and the laws of physics. But then again, why would you even want to take the physical stance towards him? Even if you had all that information, think how long it would take you to do the calculations. You'd have to work out the position and states of every molecule in Fred's body, and then do unbelievably complex calculations using the laws of physics about what those particles would do in the next moment and the moment after that, all the way up to 7:30 p.m. this evening. Calculations which, even with the fastest supercomputer, would no doubt take you far longer than 7:30 p.m., maybe even days or weeks or years. Think how difficult those calculations would be, how likely it is that you'd make errors, and so on. Whereas when you take the intentional stance, as described above, it might look a little complex when you spell it out explicitly, but in fact, it's what we do every day effortlessly, and it works beautifully most of the time. The limits of the intentional stance. But of course, the intentional stance isn't flawless. Sometimes people are not perfectly rational. Fred might miscalculate when he needs to leave to get there by 7:30 p.m., or he might just forget, or he might get tired or sick at the last minute and be unable to reach you. More interestingly, some or much of your own theory about Fred's intentional states might be wrong. Maybe he doesn't believe much of what you think he believes. You thought he believed that friendship was important, but maybe he's just really good at using people for his own benefit. Did you offer to treat him to the theater, by the way? And of course, even when it works, it doesn't work precisely to a very high degree of accuracy. You might use it to predict he'll be at the theater around 7:30 p.m., but you won't be able to predict the exact minute or second, nor be able to predict the precise route that he'll take, or precisely what he'll be wearing, and so on. If you want that sort of precision, at least in principle, you'd probably have to resort to the physical stance, if you've got the time and the computer resources to do all that calculating. The crucial point, though, is that the intentional stance works in general, adequately, most of the time, and it's simply far easier to use than the intentional stance when we're interested in predicting other people's behaviors. The bold move. The other crucial point is the controversial one. Dennett here isn't merely claiming that we use the intentional stance to predict each other's behavior. He's done some wonderful work elucidating the intentional stance and what's involved, but everyone can pretty much agree that we generally do use something like it when we're predicting each other's behaviors. What's bold and interesting and controversial is the deeper claim, namely that being predictable by use of the intentional stance is all there is to being a true believer. That any being which is reliably and voluminously predictable in this way genuinely and truly has intentional states, regardless of whatever might be going on inside it. Before we begin to critique the theory, though, Let's stress the importance of this qualification that one's behavior must be voluminously predictable. If not, without that qualification, then there would be no constraints whatsoever on how we use the intentional stance, and consequently no constraints whatsoever on what sorts of things count as genuinely having intentional states. Consider the lectern that happens to be before me right now, for example. I could ascribe to it the desire to be in the center of the universe, and the belief that it is in the center of the universe, and thus predict that it will not move at all on its own initiative. A very successful prediction, to be sure. But of course, no one would be inclined to say that this was a real prediction, or that the lectern was a rational agent with any genuine intentional states at all. This prediction was too simple, too limited, inadequately voluminous, we might say. Human beings' behavior, to the contrary, is quite voluminously predictable by use of the intentional stance. And so, on the other end of the spectrum, we pretty unambiguously count as having genuine intentional states. The interesting and more difficult and more controversial cases, however, lie at various points between these two extremes, as we will see in a moment. Problems for Dennett's intentional stance theory. There are quite a few problems here of different degrees of severity. Let's take a look at a few. First, the theory is non-physicalist. It doesn't attempt to analyze or reduce intentional states to something non-mental, and thus makes no effort to explain how intentionality actually arises in a physical entity, such as our brains. So, for many thinkers at least, however insightful Dennett's theory might be, it simply hasn't explained what they think most needs explaining, how mentality arises from our physical brains. Second, perhaps more significantly, it's hard for many people to accept Dennett's starting point, that having intentional states is not so much an objective black and white affair, but is rather a matter of interpretation. Perhaps in some cases the attribution of beliefs and desires is subjective and interpretive and so on, but it also seems in many cases that it isn't. For one example, consider Freudian psychoanalysis, which we discussed back in Lecture 3. You and Freud would very likely disagree on precisely what beliefs to attribute to your mother, even if you might make similarly accurate predictions of her overall behavior. Let's say that you predict she'll give you a big birthday present this year. You make this prediction because you ascribe to her the belief that you're the best child a mother could ever have. But then Freud chats with her for a while, and while agreeing with your prediction, ascribes to her a rather different set of intentional states. She doesn't particularly think that you're an impressive child, but she unconsciously desires for you to become very attached to her and believes that by showering gifts on you, you will become so attached. Well, now you and Freud have made the same prediction, a birthday bonanza for you this year. But you've done so on the basis of very different ascriptions of intentional states. The natural question is, who's right? Does she believe you're the best child a mother could have or not? Does she desire you to become extremely attached to her or not? And what precisely motivates her behavior? The example is a little fanciful, but the point is serious. Different people will interpret a particular person quite differently, ascribing different intentional states. And very often, at least, our inclination is to say that if two interpreters disagree, they can't both be right. But Dennett's theory offers no way to resolve such disputes, and maybe even embraces them. Which intentional states a being has are those which one may use to make reliable predictions of behavior. If different predictors use different systems, ascribe different sets of beliefs, then they're all equally legitimate, and that's precisely what seems problematic to many thinkers. A third problem for Dennett. Third, on his theory, it seems that whether a system or being counts as having genuine intentional states might well be a matter of degree. You might be perfectly convinced that we human beings genuinely have mental states. But what about chimpanzees and dogs and cats and snails and insects and amoeba? To varying degrees, the behaviors of all these animals seem fairly and reliably predictable on the basis of the intentional stance. But at what point does a creature cross the line into having genuine intentionality? A certain kind of wasp makes elaborate preparations to ensure that its young have food, but does it possess the desire, ensure my young have food? A chimp can seem fairly human in behavior until it suddenly does something very unhuman. Is that a fit of irrationality, Or were we wrong to treat it as having intentional states in the first place? The basic worry, then, is that being reliably and voluminously predictable is very much a matter of degree. The intentional stance works very well for humans, less well for chimps, less well still for lower-level animals, and at some point becomes rather useless or trivial, as in the lectern example a few moments ago. But intentionality, genuinely having mental states, does not seem to be a matter of degree. Either snails have intentional states, thoughts, beliefs, desires, or they don't. And Dennett doesn't seem to be able to offer anything other than some arbitrary cutoff point for determining the answer to such questions. That's, of course, what I meant earlier when I noted that Dennett's theory blurs the line between derived and original intentionality. For it doesn't tell us the precise cutoff point between a system we're merely interpreting to have intentional states and one which truly, genuinely does. Fourth problem. Dennett simply offers no account at all of why the intentional stance actually works. At most, he suggests that what it captures are large-scale patterns of behavior, not anything internal. So in ascribing intentional states, we're not making reference to any particular internal states of ourselves. He thus does not and cannot say what makes some particular state of yourself, like a particular brain state, count as a belief or a desire with a particular content or object, nor can he explain just why we act as if we truly have distinct intentional states. So something major seems to be left out here. But more than that, it means that Dennett has to give up something we saw as very important in our previous lecture, Lecture 7, the one concerning mind-body causation. For causes always are particular discrete things or states. When you ask what caused some particular event, there is always something particular and discrete you're looking for. But since Dennett denies that intentional states correspond to any particular internal states, then he cannot say that you, for example, acted because you believed and desired a certain thing. So there's no causal account of our behavior here. By dropping the intuitive idea that intentional states are inner states of a being, inner states of ourselves, Dennett is therefore losing out on something crucial. Fifth and final problem for Dennett is this. From the first-person perspective, we simply know we have intentional states and can generally say pretty specifically which intentional states we have. By and large, I know what I believe and desire, even if there can be fuzzier cases where I'm not sure precisely what it is I believe and desire. We know our own intentional states on the basis of introspection, not on the basis of the intentional stance. We know in our own cases that whether or not we have such states is not a matter of interpretation or of degree, it's a perfectly objective truth. Now, of course, we cannot access other people's intentional states in the way that we can access our own, a point we made about all things mental way back in Lecture 1. So indeed, we must and do use the intentional stance in order to ascribe beliefs to others. But what all this suggests is that the intentional stance is merely a tool we use to figure out what intentional states people have. It does not itself provide the very criterion for having such states. A person either has or does not have a particular intentional state, no matter how reliable and voluminous someone else's ability to predict his behavior on the basis of the intentional stance may be. But that is to suggest that having intentional states does not depend on and is not constituted by one's predictability by means of the intentional stance. In this lecture, we began our examination of intentionality, the property by which our mental states are about things. In particular, we examined Daniel Dennett's theory that having intentional states is just a matter of one's behavior being appropriately predictable on the basis of what he called the intentional stance. That is, if ascribing intentional states to a being helps you make good predictions of its behavior, then that being simply does have those intentional states. But we also raised a number of concerns about Dennett's theory, suggesting that it does not quite capture everything we seek to understand about intentionality. In particular, it fails to explain just how intentionality can arise in a purely physical system. We thus turn our attention to the next theory, which lays the groundwork for just that in the next lecture.
This ends Lecture 8.